Here is how this exercise works for me. I went online, I did an image search, and the keyword I used was just haiku. So I was looking for haiku, and I looked at a number of them, and I ended up writing Sinkane that were inspired by most of them. But in this case, I wrote a haiku that was inspired by the sentiment in this poem. And it has a very significant meaning because if I were looking at haiku in Japan and I was part of the Japanese heritage, the history, the climate, and so forth, I would recognize in any haiku that cherry blossoms symbolize spring. And so in this poem, it's highlighting how that aspect of traditional Japanese haiku doesn't translate to other cultures, environments, and so forth. Because, for example, in rural Iowa, cherry blossoms have nothing to do with spring. It doesn't mean anything of that sort. And so that got me to thinking about what does symbolize spring in rural Iowa? And I started thinking about that and wondering, well, what could I write as a haiku that would reflect springtime in Iowa? And that led me to write this haiku. The first thing I thought about for an Iowa spring were the tractors plowing fields and getting them ready for planting. So the first image that I have in the haiku is reflective of that, tractors tilling soil. However, instead of using plowing, I use tilling because that is more representative of spring and planting. In the second line, I build on that planting motif by bringing in fertilizer trucks. These typically will come into the fields after the planting is done and the seeds have sprouted, but they're still in the early part of the growing cycle, late spring, early summer, and that reinforces that initial image that this is at the beginning of the growing season rather than the end of it. The third line continues with the conceit of planting with the word seeding, but then we get the turn. And that turn puts things in somewhat of a different perspective because I refer to the harvest. So the tractors and the fertilizer trucks and the seeding, so the planting, isn't the only thing that this poem is about. It's also about the product of all that activity, which is the harvest. And so the farmers aren't doing these activities just to grow plants, they're doing it so they can harvest them in the fall and reap the rewards of having done so. In that sense, this poem is about the spring, but it's also about the fall. And so it comes full circle and it kind of ties together both of those seasons in a single poem. At least for me, that is what's going on in this poem. And I wouldn't have written that poem if I hadn't read this one. And more importantly, if I hadn't thought about this poem. Because this exercise isn't about just passively reading a poem to experience it. It's about thinking about that poem in relation to what it means to me, how it impacts me, what it connects to in my past, or what I have learned that relates to it, and so forth. And so it's about active reading. And when you do active reading, you are looking at what you're reading to integrate it into your knowledge base and make it a part of it by linking it to other things that you know or that you've experienced. Now, it's easy to do that when a poem, in this case, connects to you in a meaningful way, emotionally or spiritually or intellectually. But it's much more difficult to do that when it doesn't. In this case, it was an easy poem to produce because Shelley's poem resonated with me. I have thought the same thing about cherry blossoms not being very meaningful to me with regards to being a symbol of spring. And it's because where I live, what I've experienced, and so forth, doesn't lead to that natural connection that it would for a Japanese reader familiar with traditional haiku and its symbology